Welcome to a topic that many people really want to learn about, and that is the Context API for Advanced State Management. And we're gonna start by exploring React's Context API in isolation, where I'll teach you a very powerful context pattern. After that, we'll take what we learned and apply it to the world-wide application that we have been building. We will also dive even deeper into state management itself and learn about some new types of state and tools to handle them. Along the way, we'll wrap up this project, for example, by including this nice interactive map, which is the reason why this section runs a little bit longer than the other ones. So let's waste no time and get back to the actual course. Let's do something unconventional now and start the section with a challenge. However, this is a very different challenge, because all I want you to do in this one is to study and understand both the code and the data flow in a small new application on your own. And to get started, let's just open up our starter files and then let's go to this project number 12 called Atomic Block, and then let's copy the entire starter folder onto our desktop. And then we can just rename it to Atomic Block again. And then all we're going to do is to open it up in VS Code. So this time we are not creating a new project from scratch using Create React App or Vite, but instead I already did that before, and so here are all the files now. So the idea of this challenge is that someone on your team built this small project before you had joined the team, and so now they handed that project over to you, and so of course then you need to jump into the project and understand how it works and what it does. And so that is basically the goal of this challenge. So this is a super important skill to have as a React developer, especially if you work on a team with other developers. So then you really need to be able to understand the React code that other developers wrote. And so that's what we will do now. So first of all, notice how we don't have any node modules folder. And so the first thing to do is to install that by opening up our terminal and run npm install. Now we don't even know how this project was built. So if it is a Vite project or if it's a Create React App project. And to check that out, we can open up our package.json, and then here in the scripts, we see that all of them start with React scripts and not Vite. So therefore, this is a Create React App. Okay, therefore, that means that we start this application by running npm start. So otherwise, we wouldn't even know how to start this application. Now here we have something running already. So let's just try another one. And there we go. So it takes some time to open here as always, but then here it is. So this is the Atomic Block. Now, I will not explain what this application is and what it does, because that's the whole point of this challenge. So for the rest of this video, I want you to now explore the code right here in the source code folder, and then the application here as well. So probably for that, you should take a look at the component tree first, and then move to the code and check where most of the state lives, and then how that state and the data in general flow through the application tree. Now, one of the main things that I want you to notice as you do this is how there is a lot of prop drilling going on. Now, some of that prop drilling could actually easily be solved, but this example has all of that prop drilling actually on purpose. So it's a bit of an artificial example just to showcase this problem. But anyway, I will now leave you to it. So take at least 15 or 20 minutes to understand this application now, because you will need to understand it actually to keep going in this section. So I will suppose that after this lecture, you really know the codebase in and out. And then once you're done doing that, I meet you in the next lecture where we will talk about what the context API is. Let's start this section by understanding what the context API is and what problem it solves. And we're actually going to start with the problem that the context API solves. So let's say that in our application, we need to pass some state into multiple deeply nested child components, just like in this fictional example. So in this application, the components B and F both need access to the count state variable. And so that's the task that we need to solve. Now, the first solution that comes to mind is to simply pass the state variable as props all the way down until it reaches the components that need the count state. However, this then creates a new problem, because passing props down through multiple levels of the tree can quickly become cumbersome and inconvenient. And we actually talked about exactly this problem before, a problem that we call prop drilling. Now, back then, I told you that one good solution to prop drilling is to compose components in a better way. However, doing so is not always possible. And so, component composition with the children prop, as we have learned before, doesn't always solve this problem. So, instead, what we need is actually a way of directly passing the state from a parent component into a deeply nested child component. So that would immediately solve the problem, right? Well, it turns out that React has actually thought of that and has given us the context API to do just that. So the context API basically allows components everywhere in the tree to read state that a context shares. But so let's now look at that in a bit more detail. So first of all, the context API is a system to pass data throughout the application without having to manually pass props down the component tree. It essentially allows us to broadcast global state, so state that should be available to all the child components of a certain context. Now, in order to learn about the different parts of this system, let's bring back the component tree from the previous slide. So the first part of the context API is the provider, which is a special React component that gives all child components access to a so-called value. And this provider can sit everywhere in the component tree, but it's common to place it at the very top. Now, this value that I was talking about is the data that we want to make available. So the data that we want to broadcast through the provider. And so we pass this value into the provider. Usually, this value contains one or more state variables and even some setter functions. Finally, we have consumers, which are all the components that read the value that we passed into the provider. So, in other words, consumers are the components that subscribe to the context, and so they are able to read the value from the context. And we can create as many consumers as we want for any context provider. Okay, so that's how the context API works. But what happens when the context value actually changes? So when it gets updated? Well, this is where the interesting part begins. So whenever the context value is updated, all consumers will automatically be re-rendered. So all the components that are reading the context value. So again, whenever the value that is shared is updated in some way, the provider will immediately notify the consumers about the value change, and it will then re-render those components. And so this means that now we have a new way in which component instances can be re-rendered. So we already knew that state updates re-render a component instance, But now we know that an update to a context value also re-renders a component as long as that component is subscribed to that exact context. All right, and that is the fundamentals of the context API and how it solves the prop drilling problem. We can create as many contexts as we want in our application and place them wherever we want in the component tree. And so all this allows for new and interesting ways of managing state, as we're going to explore throughout this section. Welcome back. So let's now start using the context API in practice in the atomic block application that you have studied earlier. So, as I said in that challenge lecture, it's extremely important that you got yourself highly familiar with this application, because what we're going to do now and over the next few lectures is to completely refactor this entire application from having all the prop drilling that you find in this application to using the context API instead. And we are going to learn about the context API here in this separate project, because this one is a lot simpler than the world-wise application, and like this, we can learn this very important part of React more in isolation, so that we don't mix many different concepts all together. But anyway, that's enough talk. Let's just very quickly go together through this application, just so we are all on the same page. So as the application loads, we create these 30 random posts and store them into the posts array. So remember that this callback function here only runs on the initial render, right? Then here the posts are actually filtered by the search query that we can type up here. So if we type fire, then only these posts here that have fire in the title or in the text will show up. Right? And what else do we have? Then we have two event handler functions here to add a new post and to clear all the posts. And then we pass all of that stuff here as props into these multiple components. And some of it really is prop drilling because, for example, here the header doesn't even need this posts prop, but all it does is to pass this data right into the next component. So result in this case. And the same thing for these other props here. So this component doesn't really need these props, at least not these three here. All it does is to pass them down. And so that's what we mean by prop drilling. Now let's also take a look at the component tree here. As always, that's extremely important. And so, for example, here we can see that this list component is one of the components that needs the posts. And so for that, we need to pass the posts from app to main to posts and then to list. So a huge chain of prop drilling right there. All right, then down here we have some more code, which is not really relevant, and especially not this one. So the archive here is not really important. Again, we will mostly use that for some other thing even later, so even in another section. But anyway, let's now start to solving this prop drilling problem and learn how the context API works in practice. So remember from the last video that basically the context API has three parts. There is a provider, there is a value, and then there are all the consumer components which will read the value from the context. And so let's start with the first step, which is to create the provider. So in order to do that, we first need to create a new context. So for that, we call create context, which is a function that is included in React. So just like useState or useEffect. So make sure that it got imported here from React. Now, into this create context function, we could pass in a default value for this context. However, we usually never do that because that value cannot change over time. And so it's actually pretty useless. So instead, we usually pass in null, or we just leave this empty altogether. But anyway, calling createContext will return, as the name says, a context. So let's call this a post context in this case, because here we are going to store the information about posts. Now this turned blue here, because that's our fake dark mode, which maybe you have also discovered while going through this application. Now notice how here the variable name actually starts with an uppercase letter. And so the reason for that is that this is actually basically a component. And so components always use here the uppercase letter at the beginning. So let's just write out what we just did. So our 3 steps. The first one is to create a new context. So we have our context now, and now we can pass the value into the context provider. So let's then go right here into our JSX, because this is where we are going to use that component. And let's actually make it the parent component of all of these ones right here. So let's place it really outside here. So post context, and now on there we read or we get the dot provider property. Then we close that, and then we need to, of course, place this here at the very end. So right here, and there we go. Now this on its own, of course, doesn't do anything yet, because now what we need to do is to pass the value into this provider. And so this is basically the second step. So the second step is to provide value to the child components. So to do that, here we specify the value prop on this component, and then we enter JavaScript mode so that here we can then define an object. So here we need an object which will contain all the data that we want to make accessible to the child components. And so that's basically going to be similar to these props that we have here. So for example, one of the entries in this object will be posts. So the posts should be equal to the searched posts. And so then that's exactly what we have here. So here we pass in a props called post, which is equal to the search posts variable that we have in this component. And so we can keep going and keep adding all of them. So we also want on clear posts to be handle clear posts. And of course, we also want to pass our function to add posts. So on add post should be equal handle add post. All right. So basically what we did was to pass this state right here, so this derived state, and these 2 event handler functions into our context value. So we created an object which contains one property for each of these values that we want to pass in. All right. And so let's now do the same thing also for the search query. So search query actually equal to search query. So there we don't need to change anything. And then also set search query. So remember that having this is exactly the same thing as this, right? And so then we don't need to write that second part. Now, usually we create one context per state domain. So basically we would have one context only for the posts, and then another context only for the search data here. So in fact, this is actually called the post context, and so it should only be for these 3 parts here. And then we could also create a search context where we would place these 2. So that would be a bit cleaner, but here we are just learning how context works, and so that's not really a problem. Okay, so now we have all our data here inside our context, and so it's time to consume the context in all the components that actually need access to this data. And so let's do that in the next lecture. With the context provider and value now in place, let's consume the context value in multiple components and get rid of all the annoying props that we have in our app. And let's actually start by removing props from one component at a time. So starting here with the header, let's get rid of all of this so that we can then recreate the same functionality only by reading the value out of the context. So as we save this now, we will get tons of errors here, because for now, these components, of course, still rely on the props. But anyway, moving now into the header component where we just removed those props from, let's see if this component actually does need some data from the context. So here we can remove all these props. And so if all we have is props, then that means that this component itself doesn't need any data, so any value out of the context. But actually it does, because here we have this onClearPosts prop, which again, this component really needs. And so therefore, we now need to get this onClearPosts function from the context. So of course, let's remove all the props there, because we are no longer receiving props. And instead, let's now read this function right here from the context. So to do that, it's time to meet yet another React hook. And this one is simply called useContext. So make sure that you import it from React. So just like this, because it is indeed another function that is coming from the React library. And then here, what we need to do is to pass in the entire context object. So that's postContext, and not postContext.provider or .consumer, which also exists, but really only postContext. So this will then return something, and let's just call that X for now and take a look at it. Now this is not going to work because of all the errors that we have here. So let's just comment all of this out, which you don't have to do, but this is just to show you what this hook here actually returns. And so here we can see that it does basically return the entire value that we passed into the context. So this object right here, so the result of the useQuery hook is exactly this value that we passed in here. And so we can then destructure that here and basically take out only the part that we want. So that's onClearPosts in this case. Okay, but that of course still gives us errors, and that's because results and search posts of course also rely on some props. So let's move on here and let's also give them their value from the context. So here let me just place a comment just to complete our sequence. So 1, 2, and now 3, which is consuming the context value. And so this is then the third step of what we need to do when we use the context. And so now all we need to do is the same thing in all the components that need the data. So here what we need is search query and set search query, which we are going to get from useContext. So postContext. And that's not yet it, because our next component that is also included in the header, so search posts, or actually results. So results also needs a prop that was passed into the header component. So let's grab that here as well, which is in this case just posts. So as we can see down here. So use context, post context, give it a save, and Beautiful. Now we are back to working. So let's see our component tree here again. And we can make this really large because the application is not really that important. So what matters is that we passed in the value into the context provider, which we can actually see here. And then, for example, here in the results, we can see that through the context hook, we get access to all the data here. So even though we only read the posts data, here we can still see the entire content of the context, so the entire value. But what really matters here is that we got the posts data into this really nested component without having to pass in any props. And so that's exactly the functionality of the context API that we learned at the very first lecture of this section. So this posts data is basically now being broadcasted by this provider and injected into the results without ever having to pass through the header. And so the prop drilling really is gone, at least for that part, because as you see, we still have a few props here. Now, actually, I want to leave this for you as a challenge. So I want you to do what we just did, which is to remove all of the props in all of the components, and then simply use the context value to give each component access to the data that it actually needs. So pause the video now and then meet me back here in a minute where I will give you the solution. Okay, so let's just cut everything here. So all the props, we don't need them anymore. This main component here really doesn't need any of this data. So all it did with these props was to pass it down into these other components, and the same even for this one. So even this post component doesn't really do anything. So it doesn't need the posts data. Who needs the post data is this list component. So let's go there actually. And so let's give it the posts data. So destructuring the result of the use context hook. So post context. Okay. And here we don't even get any error. And since we're here, let's just also add this function right here. So on add post, use context post context. And yeah, then let's move back up because here we have another one. So this one also doesn't need the prop, but instead we now get that it was on add post from use context. And I think that's actually it. So let's just check. And indeed, none of our components now receive props anymore. And notice how much cleaner here is our JSX. I mean, we still have this button here, which is kind of ugly, and which we could actually extract into its own component. And so if you want to do that, feel free to take this and probably also this effect. And so then this whole thing here becomes even more clean. And of course, it's not only about being clean. So it also makes the components a bit more independent and standalone. So take, for example, this list component right here. If before we wanted to reuse this list somewhere else, then we would have to first pass the props to that place where we wanted to reuse it. So let's just, as an example, say that for some reason we wanted this list inside the footer. So why not? So just like this. And since we are now using context, this is really all we have to do. So we can give it a save. And if we then come here, we will see that inside the footer, well, can't really see that right now. But, well, let's see it here in our component tree. So we see that here inside the footer, we have indeed now this list. And all we had to do was to place it there. So we didn't have to pass any props first to the footer and then into the list, which we would have to do before when we didn't have the context API yet, right? And so this list was a bit less reusable and less standalone. But again, with this, we can now just place this anywhere, even if the parent component doesn't have access to the posts prop. So, which is the case right here. Okay, so with this, we finished actually implementing our context. And as you see, it was actually pretty easy, right? We can, however, do a couple of improvements to the way that we use the context API in practice. And so let's do that in the next video. Now that we know how to use the context API in practice, we can take it to the next level and implement a custom provider component as well as a custom hook to then consume the data. Now, I want to start by saying that the implementation that we have right now is actually perfectly fine. So it works great, and so in many applications, this is more than enough. However, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, we can now make this even more advanced by implementing some more advanced patterns. And so let's now do that. So the idea is basically to remove all the state and state updating logic all from this component and place it into our own custom context provider component. So we will then have all the state, and we will then provide that using context into our application. So it's basically just a refactoring of what we already have, but the functionality will stay exactly the same, and we still will have our three parts. So creating the context, then providing a value, and then reading it. We will just have these different parts in different files. Okay, so let's now start implementing that. And the first thing is to once again duplicating this file and then calling it version 1, so we can also keep the original version. Okay, and then next, let's create a new component called post context.js. Okay, and here let's actually create this function manually ourselves. So post context, and we will then later also export it. And basically what we do now is to grab all this stuff, so everything that is related to the context, and place it into that other file. So let's cut that, place that here, and then we should probably import this. So one good way of doing that is to delete part of the string, and so then we get our autocomplete back, where we just have to hit enter, and then that gets automatically imported. Now here, not sure why we're getting this error. And it's just because we of course now already have this variable called post context. And so actually I want this not to be called post context, but the post provider. So this then makes the intention of this component a bit more clear. So basically from here we will export, or we will return, a provider. So that's why we call this the post provider. All right, and now let's grab all the state and the state updating logic from here. So all of this, but of course not this effect. And then let's place that here. And then we are again missing some stuff here. So let's use that trick again to import EU state. And then we need to also copy this function right here. And here we cannot cut it because we actually need it in another function. So let's just copy it and place that here. And then we also need to copy this. So probably we should export all of this here into some other special file, but here we just want to keep it very simple. Okay, Well, actually, we also removed this state. So about the dark mode. So let's place that back right here. And then what we want is to also grab this. So cut it and remove this one here as well. All right. So again, we are just refactoring everything here into this provider. And this provider, so this component will just be another React component. And so it needs to return some JSX. And so that JSX will be this provider. Let's close it. And for now, we are good like this. And so here, I think we now removed all our errors. Now we have some problems right here, where we now are trying to read from the post context, which no longer exists, but let's take care of that later. So what we want to do now is to use that post provider here exactly in the same way that we used the provider before. So exactly what we had here earlier. So let's actually for now export this from here. So post provider. Let's do an export default for now. And so then here we are able to just import post provider like this. All right. Place that here, but that will actually still not work because watch what's happening right now. So we are passing all of these children here into the post provider component, right? But then all that we do here is to return this post context.provider, but we're not doing anything with the children. And let me demonstrate that here in the application. But before we do that, we actually need to now export this post context so that we can use it here in app. So let's now, instead of the default export, export them like this. So a named export. So post context. And so let's now here import this as name imports as well. So exactly in the same way as we exported them. So post context, and beautiful. So that basically fixes it, even though now, as I mentioned before, we have an empty page. And so the reason for that is that all we are doing now is to return this context provider. Right? So again, right here, we have the post provider component, but all this does is to return this post context.provider. And so then that's what we see in our tree. And so what we need to do now is to accept the children prop like this, and then place the children back here. And with that, then our application works again. Let's go back to normal mode and let's try to search. And yeah, so everything works the same, but now we created ourselves our own custom context provider component, which is this post provider. All right. And with this, we really cleaned up tremendously this app file. So our parent component. And here actually we can make this even a bit cleaner, because this section here and this button, of course, don't need this provider. And so with this, I think it looks even a bit better. So it's important that you understand what we just did here. So we created this post provider component, which we now wrap around all our other components. And you can always compare that with the v1 file that we created earlier. So we passed this here into the opening and the closing tag, and so therefore these will become the children of this component. So then we use the children prop here, and then we wrap all these children inside the post context provider, just like we had before. And so by doing that, we could place all the state and the state update logic into its own separate context file, which then cleaned up tremendously our main component that we have here. So this app component. And we could even do the same thing here with this fake dark mode, but let's keep it simple here. So here we could remove that from here, this comment, and place that here, but that's not really important. So with this, we finished the first part of the lecture, which was to create the context provider component. But now, remember how I told you that we are also going to create our own custom hook. And so let's see what that means. So right now, to consume the context, we are always using this use context hook, and then we pass in the post context object. And this works great, but over time, after using this many times, you will notice that it can become a bit annoying to always have to write this post context here. So basically this part here is always repeated over and over again in all the components where we actually read the value from the context. And so basically we can encapsulate this part into its own custom hook. So let's come back here into this file and then create that right here as well. So that's a very common pattern that many developers use these days. So basically placing this context provider component and then the corresponding hook all into the same file. So let's call this one here use posts, and we don't need any argument then. And so here, let's then get the value out of the context. So the entire value, which we will then return so that in our components we can destructure it. And so now we will use the use context hook right here. So using it here and then passing in the post context just like we did before. And now we can return the context like this. And then instead of returning this context here, we can leave it encapsulated inside this file and instead export this custom hook. So with this, we then basically create like an API for this context. So again, instead of exposing the context object itself, we just expose a function with which we can then access that. Okay, so this one is nicely called use posts. And so let's use that here instead of the post context. So use posts, and now we just everywhere replace this. So I will now use Command or Control D, which again is this one here. So add next occurrence to select all of them. And so then we just use posts, and beautiful. So it works again. And if you ask me, this is now a lot cleaner. So you don't have to think about the name of the context anymore. We just write use posts, and then we get whatever we want from there. Okay, now let me just show you something, which is, for example, trying to use that custom hook right here. So use posts right here. And then let's log that to the console. So what do you think is going to happen? What do you think this X will be? Well, it is undefined. So why do you think that is? Why is the context value suddenly undefined? Well, all we need to do is to look at our component tree. So we tried to use the context here inside of app, but the context only provides the value to all its children components. So only to all of these that are below the provider. So basically only to these ones right here and the ones that are inside it, but not right here. And so this could lead to some hard to find bugs in a larger application. And so let's now do something against this. So basically to prevent someone from using this hook, so to accessing the context value where they shouldn't. So notice how the context value was undefined. And so what we can do is to test for that. So we can check if the context is undefined, then let's just throw a new error. And then let's let the developer know that post context was used outside of the post provider. And yeah, there we go. So this is actually a lot better, even though normally we don't like errors. But in a situation like this, it's actually a lot better to have directly an error here than maybe having the developer think that this somehow works. So with this, they know immediately that this cannot work. So that's why we should always create an error in the situation where we are trying to access the context where we actually cannot. Okay, and this is all I wanted to show you for this advanced pattern. So again, it is composed of two parts, basically. First, the post provider, and then our own custom hooks to read the value out of the context. And I'm showing this to you because this is basically like a recipe that you can always follow in all your own projects when you want to use the context API. So we always do this in the exact same way. So we create a context, then we create our own provider component, which receives the children so that we can then use it like this here. And then we pass the value in there. And then, of course, also return the children here. And then in the end, we always have this own custom hook. So again, always the same recipe that you can start using in your own applications. Great. So now we know really well how to use the context API in practice. And so let's now go back to talking a little bit more about state management and how the context API fits into that picture. So now that we know how the context API works, it's time to get back to talking about state management in general and how the context API fits into the state management tools that we already had before. Now, we already talked about state management earlier in the course, but it was more of an introduction. So back then, I told you that state management is basically just like giving each piece of state the right home, right? So in that lecture, we talked about when to use state, local versus global state, and I also gave you this handy flowchart to decide when and where to create state, which of course you can keep using. Now in this lecture, we will talk about UI versus remote state. I will show you all the options for where to place state and also all the state management tools that are available to us to manage all these different types of state. And let's actually start with these different types of state that can exist in all web applications. So we can classify state in terms of state accessibility and in terms of state domain. Now, when it comes to state accessibility, state can be either a local state or global state. And we already talked about this, but I just want to quickly review these super important concepts. So, local state is only needed by one or a few components, while global state might be needed by many components in different positions of the tree. That's why local state is only accessible inside the component that it was defined in, plus maybe its child components, while global state can actually be made accessible to every single component in the application. So it's the accessibility of a state variable that changes between local and global state. Now, if you need to create a new state variable in a component, but are not sure whether it should be local or global state, there is a very nice trick that can help. So all you need to do is to ask yourself, if this component was rendered twice, should a state update in one of the components reflect in the other one? And if the answer is no, then it means that it's local state. But if the answer is yes, you have found yourself a global state variable. So just keep this trick in mind for the future, as it can be quite helpful. Okay, and now moving on to the state domain, we can classify each piece of state as either remote state or UI state. So remote state is basically all application data that is loaded from a remote server, so usually using an API. So it's basically state that lives on a server but that can be loaded into our application. UI state, on the other hand, is basically everything else. So things like the currently selected theme, applied list filters, form inputs, open panels, and many, many more. So again, all state that is not the core application data that we usually fetch from an API is UI state. So whenever you have some state, it's extremely important to always know whether you're dealing with remote state or with UI state, because they need to be managed in a completely different way. So remote state is fundamentally different from UI state, because we usually get it in an asynchronous way, and because the data might need to be refetched and updated frequently. Therefore, in a large-scale application, remote state should be cached, revalidated, and so on. And so for that, we need some specialized tools. UI state, on the other hand, is usually synchronous and stored right in the application and does not interact with any server at all. And so this means that UI state is very easy to handle with the tools that we already know of. So things like useState or useReducer. And we will take a closer look at these tools later in this lecture, but for now, let's focus on where we can actually physically place each state variable in our codebase. So, whenever we need a new piece of state, we have about 6 different options on where we can place it. If all we need is local state, then we simply place it in a local component using useState, useReducer, or even useRef. So a ref can also be considered state, even though it won't re-render the component. Now, many times we actually need a piece of state in multiple related components. And so then it's time to lift the state up by placing it in a parent component of all the components that need it. So a parent component is another state placement option. However, even that sometimes is not enough. So sometimes we have actual global state, and then one good solution is to place the state into a context. So this is where the context API that we have been learning about comes into play, as we can use it together with useState or useReducer to manage global state. Just note that context on its own is actually not who is managing the state. State still needs to be managed, so to be created and updated by useState or by useReducer. But we then use the context API to give all components in the tree access to that state. But anyway, the context API is actually best suited to manage UI state and not necessarily remote state, especially when you are building a bigger application. But more about that in the next slide. So, if you need to manage remote state in a complex application, or just need a more efficient way of managing global state in general, you can opt for one of the many third-party state management libraries that exist in the React ecosystem. So you can place your global state into Redux, into React Query, or SWR, or Zustand, or one of the many other external state management solutions. And some of these solutions are suited for global remote state and some for global UI state, or both. Okay, next up, as we learned in the previous section, is the URL. So the URL is yet another excellent place where we can store global state that we want to make easily shareable and bookmarkable, or that we just want to pass between pages. And finally, sometimes we need to store some data inside the user's browser. And in that case, we can use local storage, session storage, or something like that. Now, just like refs, this is state that won't actually re-render any components, but it's still technically application state, which is why I included this in this list as yet another possible state location. Alright, so hopefully this is a helpful overview for you that you can keep handy once you start building your own applications. And now to finish, let's try to answer the question of how to manage the different types of state in practice. Or, in other words, what tools should be used for each kind of state. So, if we combine all classifications of state according to accessibility and domain, we end up with these 4 combinations. So, local UI state, global UI state, local remote state, and finally, global remote state. And so let's now look at the tools that we can use to manage each of these state types. And starting with the easiest, we simply manage local UI state with the tools that we already know about. Now, when it comes to local remote state, we can use a simple fetch inside a use effect in order to load data from a remote API and then store that data as state with useState or useReducer. So this is exactly what we've been doing all the time up until this point, right? However, this is usually only a good idea in small applications. In bigger applications, we usually just treat all remote state as global state, which brings us to the next type of state. So, when we need to manage global remote state, we have to choose if we want to use a general solution like the Context API or a library like Redux, or if we want to use a tool that is highly specialized in managing remote state. So those are tools like React Query, SWR, or RTQ Query, which have built-in mechanisms like caching and automatic refetching in order to deal with the asynchronous nature of remote state. In fact, these tools are so helpful that we will study React Query in depth in the next project. So I definitely recommend going with a solution like this. But anyway, to finish now, let's move up to global UI state. And here, the Context API coupled with useState or useReducer is a great tool. Now, if you need something a bit more performant, you can look into one of the third-party libraries that we already discussed. So something like Redux, which we will actually learn later in this section. And so by then, we will talk more about the differences between Redux and the Context API and also when to use each. Alright, so the idea of this diagram is more to give you an overview and a reference that you can keep in the future, which should be really helpful. So I really wish that I had something like this when I first started learning React development and especially learning about state management. But anyway, let's now quickly go back to the WorldWise project that we have started working on in the previous section. Now it's time to move back to the WorldWise application that we have been building to now use the Context API in exactly the way that I showed you earlier. So in this video, we're gonna create a similar custom context provider component, but this time for the cities data. So here we are back in the WorldWise application, and I hope that you didn't close your editor in the meantime. But if you did, then just make sure to start the application again and also our fake API server. So to know which commands those are, you can just open up your package.json file and then you will see that you need to do npm run dev to start the application and then npm run server for our fake API. Okay. Now, as you learned in the previous lecture, just because you now know how to use the context API, that doesn't mean that it's always the right tool or the right solution for managing the state in your applications. But when you have a small-sized application like this one that we are building right now, and where performance is never going to be an issue, then the context API is a great tool indeed. Now, here we actually don't even have much prop drilling going on, but I think that it's still nice to get rid of some of the props and make the code look a little bit cleaner. Also, by doing this, we're going to be able to move all of this state here and the state logic into its own place. And so, let's now start doing that. So, just like before, we are going to create our own custom context provider. And so, let's actually create a new folder. So that's a common practice to create a new folder called context, or could also be contexts, even though that's a bit hard to say. Okay, and now here, let's create our cities context.jsx, which again is because we are now using Vite. Okay, and so now let's follow the exact same recipe that we created ourselves earlier. So we're going to start by creating that new context, so cities context, by calling the create context function coming from React. Next up, it's then time to create that provider component. And so this one is going to be called cities provider. And remember, it will need to accept the children prop, so that we can then use this provider component as the top level component in the app component. So again, just like we did before. And now, next up, let's grab all this code here that was already selected. So all the state code and the state updating logic, which in this case includes this use effect. Let's cut that from here and place that here. And so then we just need to import use state and use effect. Write this. And we are also missing here our base URL. Let's place that here at the very top. And nice. So no more big errors, except of course right here in the application where we are now missing all of our variables. So we no longer have the cities and the is loading state here because we will pass them later using the context. Right? So we could, even why not? We could just immediately remove all of this from here. So then we can right away see how clean this component is going to look like. All right. And so the homepage actually now works because it wasn't relying on any of those state variables. So if we reload this, then everything looks fine. The only thing we can't do is to open up our application. So that won't work because for now, it doesn't have access to the cities and the is loading state. But watch how clean our application component now has become. So all it does really for now is to define these routes and match them simply to the components, so without any props. Okay, we can even remove this line of code here. And so with this, let's go back to our context provider here. So now it's actually time to use that cities context. And so that is, of course, in the return block of this component. So here we will return cities context dot provider, remember. So just like this, and then here we can immediately place the children, and then of course our value. And then we need another curly braces, which is for our object. And so now let's see what we want to do. Well, for now, we only need to pass in the cities and the is loading state. So this is all we need for now. Okay, and so let's now export this component from here. And remember how we used named exports before. So this time in this component, we don't use the default export because we will later on also export that custom hook. But for now, let's just export the cities provider. And so then in here, we will be able to import that. So let's just try to use that here. So cities provider, and you see it automatically imported that from here. And now all we need to do is to grab that from here, go all the way to the end, and beautiful. There we go. And with this, we provided both the is loading and the city state to our entire application tree. And we can see that also right here. So we have the app component, and then in there we have the cities provider, which indeed returns context.provider. Then in there is all this other stuff, which clogs up our tree here a little bit. So it makes everything a bit harder to see. But, well, that's just how it works. As you start using all these libraries, then the component tree isn't as clean as we were used to from before. Now remember that this works because we are passing in all of this here into the cities provider as children, right? And again, that's because we provided this content here between the opening and the closing tag. So that's the reason why here we really need to accept the children prop right here and then place basically all those elements that I just selected here. So all of this will then be placed here. So between the actual provider component. So the one that really provides this value here to the component tree. Okay, so this is the first part of the recipe. Next up, we need to create that custom hook so that we can then consume this value wherever we need it. So let's do that. So let's build that custom hook to consume the cities context everywhere in the application. So let's call this one here use cities. And again, we don't need any argument. And then here, let's use the use context hook that React gives us. And then we need to pass in, of course, our context. So the context from which we want to read the data. And by the way, this is necessary here. So we need to tell React which context we actually want to read from, because there can be multiple contexts. And so then, of course, React needs to know which is the one that we are interested in. So we want to then return this context, which basically is not even a context. It should be called the value. But, well, that's really not that important. What matters is that we now do again the check to see if we are using the context in the wrong place. So if this is undefined, it means that we are trying to access the content value in a place where we shouldn't. So in a place that is actually not a child component of this provider. So in this case, let's throw a new error. So cities context was used outside the cities provider. All right, and then all we need to do is to export that here and import it wherever we need it. So that was, I believe, in the city list and country list. So we can just control or command click here. So that will then open up that file. So the country list and the city list. And of course, you can also open them directly here from the components folder. Okay, So we see that this component indeed before relied on these two props. And so now let's give this component this data back, but through the context. So cities and is loading will now come from use cities. Remove that from here, and with this, it should already work. So let's make this a bit smaller, and here we go. Let's just reload that, and it works indeed. Beautiful. So receiving its data now from the context directly. And so now, all we need to do is to copy this also into the country list. So let's come here, click there. That's sometimes a bit easier than to go through all the files right there in that folder. So place that here, remove the props, and now this will not exist. So we just import that again with this nice trick. Click here and beautiful. Load that and it works. Great. So with this, we now refactored our application to using context instead of having all that logic right here in the application folder as we had before. And so now if we want to jump into this application, if we have never seen it before, and open up this component, then it's really easy to understand what it does. So there's no clutter here. All it has is the route definition. And if we then want to know about the state, we can just go to the city's provider and here to this context and see how it all works. So where the data actually comes from. And so this really is a beautiful pattern, I think. In this lecture, let's use our context to finish implementing the city component. So right now, when we click on one of these cities, it takes us to the city component, but it doesn't have any data about the city yet, except for the ID. And so let's now change that and basically fetch the data for this city and then show it in this component. So basically what we want is this. So it loads the data about the city and shows it here. So what that means is that we do an HTTP request to this URL /cities, which remember gets all the cities. But then if we take one of these IDs that is automatically generated and then pass that here, then we get only the information about this exact object right here. Now, you might be wondering why we actually need to do that if we could simply get this object out of the array that we already have, right? And that's actually true in this small application. So technically, we wouldn't have to create a new HTTP request and fetch this data from the server again, because we do actually already have it in the cities array. However, in real-world web applications, it's quite common that the single objects have a lot more data than the entire collection. So basically, this array here would only have a small amount of data in each object, while then the objects that we get individually from the API have really all the data. And so let's pretend that we really need to do this. So making a request to this URL and then /DID. So let's go to our cities, or actually our city component. And so let's fetch the data here, because this is where we need the data. So let's remove this. And what we could do is now to create that HTTP request and then create some local state here and call it, for example, current city and set current city. And then use state and then store whatever the object is here into this state, right? So that would be a perfectly valid way of doing it. However, that state would then, of course, be local state. So it would be local to only this component right here. However, we do actually need this state in another place. So to implement another feature that I'm going to show you now. So watch what happens when I go back from Lisbon. So you see that then Lisbon here is marked with this green border, which means that this is now the current city still. So basically, after we visited one of these cities, when we then go back, it marks the last visited city with this border, which means that this city item component here also uses this same piece of state. So what this means is that this state is actually global state, because multiple components in the tree need this state. And therefore, it is a good idea to actually place this not here, but inside our context. So next, close to these ones. Okay? Now, again, if we only needed this state here in one single component, it would be best to use local state in that case. However, we do need the state variable in multiple places. And so therefore, we will place it here into the city's provider and then pass it into the context. And let's do that right now, immediately. So current city. And so now all we need to do is to create a function here that loads this city, which we can then call right here as the component mounts. So that sounds a bit confusing. So let's just do that. So let's just create a function called getCity, which will just receive the city ID. And then the logic itself is actually pretty similar to this function that we already have here. So I will just copy this and place this here. And then here, remember that we now need to attach the ID to this URL. And so that's why we pass it into this function. So ID here. And then, of course, the data that we receive is placed into current city. So set current city. And that's actually it. Well, actually, this should not be here. And then, yeah, this, of course, is also an async function. All right. Now, we could also have placed this function right here. So into this component and then call it here as the component mounts. But I think it's a bit cleaner to have all these functions in the central place inside the context. So here inside this city's provider. So later on, we will also have more functions to create a new city and to delete a city. And so we will then have all these functions here in the central place. And then all we have to do is to pass that here also down into the context. So get city. And now inside this component, we can get the city and then display it. So this ID, of course, we still need, because now we need that to actually fetch the data. But anyway, let's now then get the getCity function from use cities. All right. And of course, we will then also need the current city and no longer this temporary one. And so then we can very easily do an effect like this, where we simply call the getCity function that we just got access to with the current ID, which is coming, remember, from the URL. And so we want to run this function or this effect as the component mounts. Now here React is complaining about some missing dependencies in the dependency array. So that's getCity and ID. So let's add ID here, but the getCity function that React also wants, we will actually not add for now. So even though we are required to add all the dependencies to the dependency array, now we will just remove this here and we'll come back to this in the next section. So by then I will explain you why we couldn't add this to the dependency array at this point. So we just add the ID, which is actually important because the ID might change, and so then in that case, the city corresponding to that new ID would be loaded. Okay, now let's get rid of this code here, also of this. And so now we want our actual JSX that will nicely render the city. So let's give it a save. Then we have no more errors and everything's looking good. So let's try this out. And we actually already see Lisbon there. But let's give ourselves a bit more space. Let's come back here and reload. And then I will again click on Lisbon. And there it is. Beautiful. So our logic here worked. Let's try another one, Madrid. And you saw that first it shortly displayed Lisbon. And only then, as soon as the Madrid data arrived, it then switched to this new state. So let's fix that soon. But for now, let's really understand what happens here. So let's start from the beginning. So when we click here on this link, here the URL will change. So we get a new ID, which we then read here into the city component. So then we have this ID. And we use it to call the getCity function as the component mounts. So immediately after mounting, we start calling this function, which is coming from our context. Remember? So here we have the getCity function, which will then immediately start fetching the city data for that ID. Then when that arrives, it gets stored here into the setCurrentCity state. So this state variable right here, which we also pass into the context value. And so then immediately here, this city component receives that value as it updates. And then, well, here we destructure it and then display everything in the UI. So basically here we do child to parent communication. So we call this function here, which will then update the current city, and then the current city will come back down here into this component where we can then use it. But now about this issue that we saw earlier. So if I click here now, then it will shortly still show Lisbon, right? So saw that for half a second, it still showed us the current city. And the reason for that is very simple. It's because that was the earlier current city, so the one from before. And so nowhere we are resetting that. And actually we don't want to reset. So because remember, we want to then use the current city to display this green border. But what we want to do instead is to show a loading spinner here. So let's also get the isLoading state. And then depending on that, we want to display the spinner. So where do you think we should do that? Right here, maybe? Well, let's try, and then you will see what happens. So if isLoading, then return the spinner. And let's see if we already have it included. No, we don't. But now it is. But as I save this, here we get this ESLint error. And so the reason for that is because we violated the very important rule of hooks, which says that hooks always need to be called in the same order. So by having this return here before this hook, this one here might never actually be created. And so that's a problem. So let's do that maybe here. Or well, let's do it really close to the other return. And so now, watch what happens. Yeah, nice. Then we get the loading spinner and then our city. And now let's implement that feature which shows us which is the current city. So again, that's just this green border right here. So that is right in the city item. So right here, and basically we have a special class for the active city. So that's this class right here. So let's just copy that. And so here we want to now conditionally apply that. So remember that if we want to add multiple class names with CSS modules, we need to do so in a string. So let's create a template literal. So this one we want for sure, but now we need to conditionally add that class. So in which situation do we actually want to add that class? So when is a city active? Well, it is the active, or actually the current city, when the city ID is equal to the current city ID. So to this one here, right? And so we now need to read that current city here into this component. So current city, which we get from use cities. That's right. Okay, and now here we can do our conditional. So if the ID is equal to current city dot ID, then here we want styles, and now we cannot do this. So this doesn't work because of the dashes in the name. And so instead we need to do this. All right, and otherwise don't place any other class there. And we see immediately that it works. So let's try that with Lisbon, go back, and nice. So now that is the current city. Here we have some errors. Yeah, so that's nothing meaningful. What matters is that the feature now works. And now finally notice how we always have to click here on cities in order to go back. So actually what we want here is a button that allows us to go back. So similar to the button that we have when we click here to show the form. Remember that? So as I click here, it opens this form. And so here we have this back button. And so now we want exactly the same in the city component. So let's come to the form. And so what we want is this button plus this functionality here. So should we now just copy and paste this button? Well, actually no. I think it would be a good idea to now make a component for this button because we clearly need to reuse this. And so this is a great candidate to extract into a new component. So let me just copy it actually. So I will remove it later. And then let's call this one the back button. So then our snippet here as always. And now what we want to return from here is this button. But this button actually depends on a few things. So for example, this navigate function right here. So let's cut that, place that here, but then of course we are missing the import. So let's also grab that from here, and maybe we can actually remove this from here for now, because then we will want to import it, of course. Okay, and now we just need to import the button. So let me just remove a piece of this here, and nice, there it is. So I think this should be complete. Let's close this, and then let's import that here. So the back button, which somehow doesn't work, so the import. So let's just do that manually here. So back button, and nice. There is our button back. And now if we go to the city and then one of these cities here, let's go there. We can close all of this. And so let's inside this div here, add that back button. And there it is. Let's see. And indeed, it does go back. Great. So this was a long lecture where we did a lot of different things. And so please make sure to review everything that we did here. Just clean up this. And so then with this, we are actually finished and can move on to the next topic, which will be to finally add the actual map here to this container.